Hello everyone, we are the group number 6 and we are here to report about the 1899 and 1935 Malolos Constitution. So I hope that you guys would listen very well and enjoy listening as well.
The 1899 Malolos Constitution was the basic law of the First Philippine Republic. It was written in Spanish, which was the official language of the Philippines at that time, and it was enacted on January 21, 1899. The 1899 Malolos Constitution was approved by the Malolos Congress on November 29, 1898. Draft returned by President Aguinaldo on December 1, 1898 for amendments which the Congress refused, and on December 23, 1898 it was approved by President Aguinaldo and formally adopted by the Malolos Congress on January 20, 1899. And lastly, it was promulgated by President Emilio Aguinaldo on January 21, 1899. The 1899 Malolos Constitution was known as the Constitución Política de Malolos, and it was written in Spanish. A committee headed by Felipe Calderon and aided by Cayetano Arellano, the Constitution was drafted for the first time by representatives of the Filipino people, and it is the first Republican Constitution in Asia. The Constitution was inspired by the constitutions of Mexico, Guatemala, Costa Rica, Brazil, Belgium, and France. After some minor revisions, mainly due to the objections of Apolinario Mabini, the final draft of the Constitution was presented to Aguinaldo, and this paved the way to launching the First Philippine Republic. It established a democratic republication government with three branches: the executive, legislative, and the judicial branches. The executive powers were to be exercised by the President of the Republic with the help of his cabinet. Judicial powers were given to the Supreme Court and other lower courts to be created by law. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was to be elected by the legislature with the concurrence of the President and his cabinet. The Constitution specifically provided for safeguards against abuses and enumerated the national and individual rights not only of the Filipinos and of the aliens. It stated there that the people have exclusive sovereignty, basic civil rights, separated the church from the state, and called for the creation of an assembly of representatives which would act as the legislative body. It also calls for a presidential form of government with the president elected for a term of 4 years by a majority of the assembly. The most contentious issue in the Revolutionary Congress that crafted the 1899 Malolos Constitution pertained to the separation of church and state. For a historical perspective, the principle of separation of church and state was a reaction to the union of church and state, which was expressed in Patronato Real or royal patronage. This was operative in Europe and in the Philippines for 3 centuries under Spanish colonial rule. While the principle honors distinctions between temporal and spiritual functions, both church and state maintain a unique and cooperative relationship geared towards the common good. However, traditional boundaries governing political and religious agency have been crossed during former President Duterte's presidency, causing a conflict between leaders of government and the Catholic hierarchy.
Now let's talk about the 1935 Malolos Constitution. The 1935 Malolos Constitution was written with the approval of the United States government to ensure that they live up to the promise of granting the country independence. It was ratified in the year 1935. So the 1935 Constitution of the Philippines was created by the Commonwealth of the Philippines and was drafted by C.M. Recto or Claro M. Recto. It was based on the principles of the separation of powers among the 3 branches of the government, which is the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. So the 1935 Constitution was the first body of law to affect the whole country. It gave the Philippines 26 years of stable constitutional government during a period wherein several other Asian states were succumbing to military dictatorship or communist revolution. This is because it provided us with a republican state, wherein sovereignty resides in the people and all government authority emanates. Though many Filipinos came to believe that the Constitution only provided a democratic political cloak for a profoundly oligarchic society, it still gave the Philippines its autonomy. Additionally, the Constitution is significant because it protects the individual freedom of the citizens. The Constitution places the government power in the hands of the citizens, wherein males aged 21 and above who can read and write have the right to vote for a president and vice president.
So the 1935 Constitution of the Philippines, which created the Commonwealth of the Philippines, was based on the principle of separation of powers among the three branches of the government. First is the executive power, which is vested to the president, which shall serve for a single 6-year term. And then we also have the legislative power, which is vested in a unicameral National Assembly. And lastly, we have the judicial power, which is exercised by the Supreme Court. So although the 1935 Constitution was not the first body of law to ever be created, it was, however, the first to be fully effective throughout the Philippines. It was created with the intent of gaining the approval of the United States government, who at the time was occupying the country. The thought was that without a constitution of its own, the occupying US forces would be able to claim the Philippines is not politically developed enough and is thus unready for independence. And accordingly, the 1935 Constitution was written with an eye to meeting the approval of the United States government so as to ensure that the US would live up to its promise to grant the Philippines independence. So it gave the Philippines at least 26 years of a stable constitutional government during a period wherein several other Asian states were succumbing to military dictatorship or communist revolution. It also provided us with a republican state, meaning sovereignty resides to us, or sovereignty resides in the people, and all government authority emanates. And as what have mentioned earlier, it became one of the reasons for the Philippines to attain independence among or against the American regime.
So in the next slide, we can see the timeline of events of the drafting and the ratification of the 1935 Constitution. In 1934, the Constitution was written by the Commonwealth of the Philippines, and as I said before, it was drafted by Clara M. Recto or CM Recto. In February 8, 1935, the draft of the Constitution was approved by the Convention of the Commonwealth of the Philippines. In May 25, 1935, our draft was submitted and was ratified by then U.S. President Roosevelt in Washington, D.C. In May 14, 1935, election for approval of the ratification of the 1935 Constitution was held, wherein 1,213,046 qualified electors voted for its ratification, while 44,963 voted against it. In June 12, 1935, the Malolos Constitution was adopted by the Philippines. So, this constitution was written to meet the requirements of the Tidings-McDuffel Act, which is officially known as the Philippine Independent Act. The Tidings-McDuffel Act is an act of Congress established in the Philippines to become an independent country after a 10-year transition period. So the purpose of this constitution was to prepare the Commonwealth of the Philippines for the turnover of power from the Americans to the Filipinos, from Commonwealth to become a republic. This constitution was greatly influenced by the Americans and possesses traces of the 1899 Malolos Constitution, the German Constitution, Spanish and Mexican Constitution, and several other American constitutions. So in the next slide, we can see the excerpts from the 1935 Malolos Constitution. As we can see, Article 1 is different from the Article 1 of the 1899 Constitution. Article 1 of the 1935 Malolos Constitution states that the United States gives jurisdiction of its islands to the Philippine government. So this is where the turnover takes place. In Article 4, it gives us the qualification of a Filipino citizen. So the criteria to become a Filipino citizen at the time was to be a citizen who was in the Philippine Islands at the time of the adoption of the 1935 Constitution. The second criterion is are those who are born in the Philippine Islands of foreign parents who, before the adoption of this constitution, has been elected to public office in the Philippine Islands. So, for example, you are a Filipino, you are a person who was born in the Philippine Islands, but your parents are foreign, but they work in office, so your parents are like Congress. During the 1935 Constitution, you were considered as a citizen of the Philippines. The third criterion was Filipino citizen is considered the Filipino citizens because their fathers are citizens of the Philippines. Next are those whose mothers are citizens of the Philippines and upon reaching the age of majority elect Philippine citizenship. So if your father was a Filipino citizen, you were directly considered a Filipino citizen. But if your mother was a Filipino citizen, you would wait until you were 18 years old and above to decide wherein you wanted to be a Filipino or not. And lastly, the criterion to become the citizen of the Philippines was those who are naturalized in accordance with the law. So naturalization, as we know, are the people who lived in the Philippines for a long time. And instead of opting to become a Filipino citizen, they opt to be a permanent resident in the country. So the next is Article 13.1, wherein the flag of the Philippines shall be red, white, and blue, with the sun and 3 stars as consecrated and honored by the Filipino people and recognized by the law. Article 13.4 states that the state shall promote scientific research and invention. Arts and letters shall be under its patronage. The exclusive rights to writings and inventions shall be secured to authors and inventors for a limited period. So this is where we can see that we are entirely separate from the Americans because the Philippines is no longer under its hold because we have freedom to claim the inventions of the Filipino inventors. In Article 16, it discusses about the special provisions effective upon the proclamation of the independence of the Philippines. And next is the Article 17. The Article 17 states that the government established by this constitution shall be known as the Commonwealth of the Philippines. And upon the final and complete withdrawal of the sovereignty of the United States, the proclamation of the Philippine independence, the Commonwealth of the Philippines shall thenceforth be known as the Republic of the Philippines. Now, as we know, there is not much difference from a commonwealth to a republic. But why did we want to become a republic instead of a commonwealth? So I will define the terms. A republic is a form of government wherein political power is held by the people through their elected representatives with an elected head of a state of government. So as we all know, we are a republic right now. So basically a republic is a democratic country. A commonwealth, meanwhile, refers to an independent state created for the common good and includes various forms of government such as republics, constitutional monarchies, federations, and confederations. An example of a commonwealth country is Australia. As we all know that Australia has a prime minister, they also have a president, but they also are under the authority of the monarchy of Great Britain. So even though Australia is far from Great Britain, they consider now King Charles as the reigning monarch. The royal family does have authority in Australia, but it is more because of the legacy of the British colonization in the country, wherein they would send slaves from Great Britain to Australia. I think it still actually happens now, but it's more low-key. This can be seen in the way that Australians have Queen Elizabeth in their money. So even though Queen Elizabeth is dead, the minting of money would start. The minting of money of King Charles's head on their coins would be started next year. So Queen Elizabeth was in their money because she was the head monarch and was minted into their coins, similarly to how we have Dr. Jose Rizal on our 1 peso coins. Now that she's passed, it is expected that King Charles' face would replace hers in the Australian coins. However, Queen Elizabeth's face would still remain in different monies like their $5 bill. I think she is in their $5 bill. So if the Philippines kept the Commonwealth status, this would mean that the United States would still have authority over the country, which will be different from the power that the elected officials have. So if we stayed as a Commonwealth, the Philippines would still seek approval from the United States government, which, as we all know, is very, very complicated. So that is all. Thank you.
Now is we have the economic and political issues of the 1935 Commonwealth Constitution. The issues and challenges that arose during and after the making of the 1935 Philippine Constitution were mostly the foreign occupation and the World War II. The Japanese-sponsored government nullified the 1935 Constitution and appointed a preparatory committee on the Philippine independence to replace it with a constitution that sided with Japan. In the year 1916, the US passed the Jones Act, which specified the independence would only be granted upon a formation of stable democratic government modeled on the American model, not the French model as the previous constitution had been. The US approved a 10-year transition plan in 1934 and drafted a new constitution in 1935. In the year 1940, the 1935 Constitution was amended by the National Assembly of the Philippines. The legislature was changed from unicameral assembly to bicameral Congress. The amendment also changed the term limit of the President of the Philippines from 6 years with no re-election to 4 years with a possibility of being re-elected for a second term. During the World War II, the US approved 10-year transition plan was interrupted. The Japanese-sponsored government nullified the 1935 Constitution and appointed a preparatory committee on the Philippine independence to replace it. The 1943 Constitution was used by the Second Republic with Jose P. Laurel as president. The 1943 Constitution was ratified by a Filipino collaborators who were called Kapisanan sa Paglilingkod ng Bagong Pilipinas or Kalibapi. An active guerrilla movement continued to resist the Japanese occupation, and in 1944, the Japanese forces were finally defeated by the Allies. Upon the liberation of the Philippines in the 1945, the 1935 Constitution came back into effect. The Constitution remained unaltered until 1947 when the Philippine Congress called for its amendment through the Commonwealth Act number 733. So next is we are recognizing some of the problems today that were consequences of the 1935 Constitution. So we have the national territory. The territorial dispute involves the issue of sovereignty over the geologic features above water at high tide and their surrounding territorial seas. Next is we have the land reforms. While the government has transferred land to the poor Filipinos, the recipients are prohibited from selling their land or buying additional land. As a result, most beneficiaries resell their land to agricultural elites through shadowy arrangements, further entrenching inequality.
Okay, so now that we have discussed both of the constitutions separately, let us now dive into their major similarities and differences. So for the similarities, both the 1899 and 1935 constitutions discuss the rights of the Filipinos and as well as the establishment of a democratic republication government composed of the three branches of the government, which are the executive, legislative, and the judicial branches. Now moving on to the major differences. The 1899 Constitution, Article 5 talks about the separation of the church and the state, whereas the Article number 4 of the 1935 Constitution defines the qualifications of a Filipino citizen. And another difference between them is that the 1899 Constitution only lasted for about 2 years. It only lasted from 1899 to 1901, while the 1935 Constitution, on the other hand, lasted a bit longer than that. It began from 1935 to 1943, and then as well as in 1945 to 1973. Now, another notable difference between the two constitutions is that in the 1899 Constitution, it follows the Jus Soli law. Jus Soli basically translates to the right of soil. This means that a Filipino is defined by anybody who is born in the country or in the Philippines, regardless of the citizenship of the parents. Filipino citizenship is given on anybody who is born in the country, while the 1935 Constitution, on the other hand, follows the Jus Sanguinis law, which basically translates to the right of blood. So this means that you must have Filipino blood running through your veins, or like you must have a Filipino father or Filipino mother to be given a citizenship. Okay, so I guess that ends our presentation for today. Again, we are group number 6, and I hope that you guys have listened very well to our topic, to our discussion about the 1899 Constitution and as well as the 1935 Constitution of the Philippines. And if you have any clarifications or questions or whatsoever, feel free to ask us or approach us in any possible way.